Les damos una cordial bienvenida y les agradecemos su participación en este evento. Esta tarde tenemos el privilegio de escuchar a una de las autoridades mundiales en psicología y antropología evolucionistas. Los temas que el doctor Dunbar expondrá y discutirá hoy y mañana, la evolución de las redes sociales, la evolución del lenguaje y de la mente social, ponen en relieve la importancia de la discusión transdisciplinaria y enfatizan la necesidad de abordajes que conecten las ciencias naturales con las humanidades y las ciencias sociales. Para comprender la complejidad de un tema como la mente social, es cada vez más una necesidad mirar más allá de las fronteras de nuestras disciplinas y salir de lo que muchas veces es un aislamiento poco productivo. Me alegra muchísimo ver aquí a personas de varios campos del conocimiento, representantes de diferentes saberes y de diversos abordajes teórico-metodológicos. Filósofos, lingüistas, psicólogos sociales, psicólogos clínicos, antropólogos, psicoanalistas. Luego de ver esta diversidad tan pocas veces junta, estoy convencida que este evento será una buena oportunidad para aprender y enriquecer nuestros puntos de vista y para fortalecer nuestra capacidad de escucha e intercambio de ideas. Ahora sí, voy a presentar al doctor Dunbar, quien además de ser miembro honorario del Grupo Mente y Lenguaje, es director del Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology de la Universidad de Oxford. Es también director de la British Academy Centenary Research Project From Lucy to Language, The Archeology of the Social Brain. Sus intereses y proyectos giran en torno a la evolución de las capacidades sociales en humanos, primates y ungulados, con especial énfasis en la descripción de sus bases cognitivas y neurobiológicas, así como la ecología de su conducta. Las ideas de Dumbar son muy influyentes en el campo de la psicología evolucionista y constituyen una referencia obligada en cualquier discusión académica sobre temas ligados a la evolución del lenguaje y la mente social. Además de decenas de artículos publicados en revistas del más alto nivel, entre los libros publicados en los últimos 10 años figuran How Many Friends Does One Person Need?, Dunbar's Number and Other Evolutionary Quirks, Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, Human Evolutionary Psychology y The Human Story. La conferencia va a ser en inglés, como ustedes saben, y si al final de ella tienen preguntas, las preguntas tienen que ser formuladas en inglés. Muchas gracias, Dr. Dunbar.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you today really about a subject we all are interested in. That's to say, your relationships, your friendships, and your other kinds of relationships. But let me, well, let's just go. Yes, okay. Let me start by posing a question to you in terms of the internet, because probably everybody here is on Facebook or something similar, social networking sites. We're very, well, some of us old people don't understand Facebook. But when Facebook and these other kinds, indeed the internet as a whole, things like email, were first set up, the technologists who created them made a kind of promise, if you like, and said, this will make your social world so big, you can talk to anybody in the world. You can have friends all over the world. You can have 1 million friends from every part of the world. And the question is this really true? Has this actually happened? So this is the internet, I'm told. It's all the connections. And the answer seems to be not. At least that's the story I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to try and explain why that could never happen. It's just impossible for you to have so many friends from all over the world. And these are Facebook's own data, in fact. But about a year ago, they were asked themselves how many friends do people have on their Facebook page, because they allow you to have up to 5,000, and some people have 1,000, 2,000. Anybody here have more than 1,000 friends on their Facebook page? No, good. But some people claim to, and they really do. So Facebook became interested in whether, you know, typically how many friends do people have? And the answer seems to be somewhere between 120 and 130. That's the kind of average. Of course, a few people have 500, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000, but not very many. And most of those people are journalists or writers or bands, music bands, who want to use Facebook as a kind of fan base, fan club. But for the rest of us who use these social networking sites, typically we have a number, something of that order, and that's because that number is about the number of real friends you have in the real world, your everyday friends, as it were. And it seems that even though you may have more than, let's say, 150 names, friends on your Facebook page, in fact, most of your time is spent talking to a very small number. Remarks with on your wall, as it were, for people who have just 50 friends or 150 friends or 500 friends listed. And the key thing here is the pink are girls, the blue are the boys. The key thing is that even if you have 500 people on your Facebook page, the number of people you contact regularly is quite small, and particularly this column here, which are the very frequent, most frequent contacts, like your best friends on your Facebook page. It's very, very similar, even though it goes up by tenfold the total number of friends from here to here. So it looks like that when people are talking to their friends on their Facebook page, actually most of the time they're thinking of just a few people, not everybody who's listed there. And one reason for this may be because the digital world is still not really very good at capturing what happens in natural everyday conversations. When you sit around and have a discussion with your friends in everyday life, it's a very kind of close social process. But in the digital world, it's still very clunky and the timing is poor and so on. Even things like Skype, although they're very good now, are still not quite as good as a real-world, everyday conversation. So this is a study we've just done, which asked a sample of people to do a diary every day of who they'd talk to by different modes of communication. So we have here face-to-face communication, actually spoke to them, Skype conversations here, get this right, telephone conversations here, instant messaging, these are text messages, and this is email and social networking sites, so things like Facebook. And we asked them for each contact they had by one of these means, to say how satisfied they were with that interaction, how they felt about it, and also whether or not they laughed in the course of that, whether that laughing was real laughter or whether it was an emoticon, a little smiley face or something like that, some as you might use in a text message. And the key things here is that real life face-to-face interactions and Skype, where you have instantaneous exchange with somebody in vision, you can see them, come out as much, much more satisfying than any of these other digital forms of communication. And that one of the key features of it is that laughter occurs much more often in these same kinds of face-to-face interactions, what you might think of as reality interactions, than in these other sort of more textual-based ones. And that it's the laughter itself that seems to be critical. So if you look at how satisfied, the same measure of satisfaction with the interaction that people had, depending on whether they laughed or they didn't laugh in that particular interaction by that particular means of communication, you can see that in all these forms of communication, if there was some kind of laughter involved, the interaction was seen as much more satisfactory. So there's something about the kind of textual base things like Facebook and the like, that isn't really satisfactory yet. I'm impressed at how good Skype is. It's much better than I expected. I expected it to be rather poor because it's so clunky still. But that's a technical problem. They'll get better and better, I'm sure, with time. But Skype works because you feel you're right there with the person, just as you are if you're sitting in your room talking to them. So this is one reason why the digital world and the internet world will never be better, if you like, than real life, because there's a big difference in the quality of interaction you can have. Okay, so let me go back a bit now and try and put together a big story to try and convince you as to why you will not have more friends, real friends that is, on Facebook than you have in real life. And the story starts with this relationship here, the so-called social brain hypothesis, which plots a measure of social group size in monkeys and apes. These are all monkeys, these are the apes here, against the size of the neocortex. The neocortex is the sort of smart part of the brain. It evolved relatively late. It's in the mammals, and in primates it is very big. It's a kind of primate speciality. And the social brain is then an explanation for why primates in particular have a big neocortex, or a big brain in general. And the argument is it's because they live in very complex social systems compared with other species of mammals. And these are the kind of data to support that claim. So if you look at group size as a measure of social complexity, a very simple measure, then you can see that species that live in big groups here have a big neocortex. And the apes in particular lie up here, suggesting that they have to have an even bigger computer to manage the groups that they have, because their relationships are much more complex than the relationships of monkeys themselves. Now, if you put humans into this graph, here's our relative neocortex size. About 80% of your brain volume is neocortex. So that gives you a neocortex ratio of neocortex to the rest of the brain of about 4. We read it up here to humans. It gives a group size, a predicted group size for humans of 150. Right, that's now known as Dunbar's number. And ironically, I always think this is very funny, it was named Dunbar's number by people on Facebook. So if that was you, thank you very much. It's been a great privilege. Okay, so the question is it really true that humans only have a group size that's so small, about 150? You know, after all, in Lima there are 8 million people, something like that. You know, how is it that your social world can be so small when there are so many people just living around you here? The answer is, it seems to be true, yes. Natural human groups are about 150. There's 2 kinds of data here just to show that. These are casual data, just observations in different places where this number crops up. These are people who've looked at actual group sizes in humans to find out what they are. I just kind of remark on 2 here maybe. One is the Hutterites and indeed the Amish, both of whom are fundamentalist Christian groups that moved from Central Europe to North America. They live mostly either in Pennsylvania or in the Dakotas. And they are Anabaptists, one of the Protestant communities, as it were. But they live a completely communal life. Everything is owned by the community as a community. Each family has its own house. They're farming communities. Each family has its own house. But all the work on the farm and all the land is owned by the community, and everything is done communally. All the washing is done communally, and all these kind of things. And the childcare is done communally. And their whole way of life is dedicated to this kind of communal living. It's like a commune, as it were. And remember, their beliefs are very fundamentalist. They won't have electrical equipment on their farms. They won't have tractors. Plowing is done by horses and so It's very sort of, if you like, primitive, but they're very successful communities and they've survived for very long. But what happens is when their community sizes get above 150, they split them. And they've been doing this since they started many centuries ago. And the reason they do that is that they say you cannot manage the community by peer pressure alone once it gets above 150. You have to have a police force. And because their whole way of life is against having laws, against having police forces, against having magistrates and courts and prisons and so on, they won't do that. They would rather keep the community small. And then what they can do is if there are any problems or somebody does something they shouldn't do, then they can solve that problem by peer pressure only, just by talking to the people concerned. And then they, everybody is very well behaved because everybody knows they're being watched and so on. And so levels of crime are very low. But it's so only because they keep the community size very small. Okay, so these are data trying to look at real data on community sizes. I'll just perhaps point this one out here, which is ethnographic, so tribal societies from all over the world. Each sort of column here, as it were, is one tribal society: Australian Aboriginals, hunter-gatherers from Africa, North American Indians, some South American Indians as well. And the key thing here is that you can see there are these levels of group sizes in the community. It's like having a family, which is part of an extended family, which is part of a village, which is part of a wider community. And this level of grouping in here sits very, very nicely around the average of 150. And the red lines here are the confidence limits, the 95% confidence limits around that prediction of 150 from the Great Ape social brain equation. So this level of grouping in here fits very tightly around that. And it's the level of grouping which is often referred to as a clan. It's a community of individuals, usually between about 100 and 200. So this is the tribe grouping up here at about 1,500, much, much bigger. And in these societies, these tribes are all largely hunter-gatherers, some small-scale horticulturalists, but often they live in a kind of fission fusion sort of system where they have temporary overnight camps, and maybe the camp moves quite often. This is the camp size. You can see that this clan grouping sits very nicely in between. And this was our first attempt then to look at how many people you know and who are meaningful to you in real life. So these are data from Britain on who people send Christmas cards to. The US Americans were always very puzzled by these data because they just said, what are Christmas cards? We don't send them. I don't know if you do here. It is big business. In Britain, everybody sends cards at Christmas to their friends, and they think very carefully about it. So it's a very good measure of the people who matter to you. And although it's very widely distributed, some are very mean and don't send many Christmas cards. Here, there are some people that send them even to their lawyer and their butcher, and perhaps have 300 friends listed. The average here, and it's nicely strongly peaked, the average is almost exactly 150. It's, where are we? 154, in fact. So there's some nice evidence that this figure of 150 really does occur. And here's a very famous but stupid case of a girl in Holland who had the photographs of all her friends tattooed on her arm. And if you've seen, you can see the YouTube film of it, video of it. And here they all are. Does anybody know this story? The truth of this story? It's a hoax. It turned out to be a publicity stunt by a tattoo artist. But notice how many friends she put on here. Right? She used a friend of hers as a lady tattoo artist, and she used a friend of hers to do this stunt. And they decided they would go with Dunbar's number, and they have 152 pictures on here. Now, luckily for this girl, they didn't actually tattoo them on. These are photographs pasted on, as film, because for reasons I'll show you in a minute, your friends change through life. So the bad news if this was real, is in about 5 years' time, half of those people would no longer be friends, but she would have them there forever. So don't do it. It's very funny because when you talk about this kind of stuff, particularly people sort of 16, 17, 18, that kind of age, you say, your friends change. And they say, no, 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 no. I love my friends. They're my friends for life. And you have to say, no. Come back in 5 years' time and tell me how many friends you are now the same friends you had then. It changes, believe me. Okay. So the other thing that's important about this group of 150 you have is that actually they don't all mean the same to you. Some are more important than others. So your 150 friends don't look like this, they look much more like this. Little groups with whom you have particular relationships. And in fact, this is what your social world really is. This is you in the center, and you're surrounded by these layers of friends of different emotional quality. So as you go out through these layers, the size of the layer increases, but the emotional quality of the relationship declines. And the frequency with which you contact them also declines. And then you get to the 150 here, and we know there are 2 more layers out beyond that at the very least, one at 500 here, one at 1500. Now these layers add together, as it were. So the 15 includes the 5, and the 50 includes the 15 and the 5, and so on. They're not new, it's not 50 new friends in this layer, it's just 50 altogether within that circle. But the red line here at 150 seems to differentiate the people you have a special kind of relationship with, in that it's reciprocated, it has a history, they know who you are, you know who they are. The people in these layers here, and this appears to be 1500, the number of people you can remember the faces of and put a name to. Right? So included here is the President of the country, the Queen of England, maybe, President Obama, maybe. But the difference between these friends inside the circle and President Obama is precisely the fact that if you went up to if you met one of these people, maybe you're traveling in Europe or Africa or somewhere, and you bump into them, and you say, "Oh, come and have a drink," or let's go and have something to eat together. They'll come with you and be very happy to do so. But if you ask that of President Obama, maybe even the President of Peru, I don't know, he is likely to be a little shocked and try to get away very quickly. So these are people that, yes, you know them, but they're more like acquaintances and not friends. Okay. So if you look at, as we've done, these are our data from our Christmas card study. We asked all the people who filled this questionnaire to do 2 things. It was for every single person on the list to say, how do you feel about them on an emotional closeness scale from 0 to 10? And when did you last see them, which is a measure of the sort of how often you see them. So here is yesterday, up here is 8 months ago. And you get this very nice negative relationship. And we get this frequently. But if you look at this, you can see those layers. Here's that inner core of about 5 people, the 15 people, the 50 people, the 150 people. Comes out very nicely. One of the other things that surprised us, these are basically, these are actually Belgian data. These are women from Belgium that gave, or at least these data are, filled the sample questionnaires in for us. And what's interesting about them is that it's plotting the number of friends you have, let's say people who are not related to you biologically or by marriage, against the number of kin, family, by marriage or by blood. And it turns out that this line here, which lies at exactly 150, so this is adding the figure here to the figure here, here's the upper limit at 150, nicely where it should be. That has a slope which is negative, but is greater than -1. And what that means is that if you come from a big family, if you have a big extended family, you have fewer friends, right? Because all your time and effort is taken up by this big family which you're always having to go and meet at Christmas and weddings and all these kind of things, that you don't have time to give to friends, and therefore your friendships are smaller and tend to be much weaker. This was a big surprise to us, because we didn't think kinship would be so important in a modern society, but here it is, this evidence. And here's some more evidence, the difference between family and friends, between kinship and pure friendship. So this is a study of what were started as high school students in their last year at high school and their first year at university. So they started 18 to 19 years old. And we were wanting to look what happened when they went away to university in a different city, to their friendships with the people from back home that they started out with. So over 18 months, we followed the pattern. And what this shows is the change in the emotional closeness they felt to their friends who were friends of theirs when they were at school at the start here. And if you look what happens with family, if anything, it increases. Over this time, they're away from home, absence makes the heart grow fonder, they love their family more because they don't see them. But when they don't see their friends become less important to them. Right? Look how dramatic that fall is, just over a period of 18 months. And this is the same data, but showing what happens if each of these people moves from one layer to another layer, so drops down a layer. This is what happens for family. If they stay in the same layer at the beginning as at the end, this is what happens if they move a layer. Still, the emotional closeness is very much the same. But for friends, those who stay in the same layer, yes, they still love them just as much. But if they drop down a layer, oh, they're forgetting about them. Now, this is how to prevent your friendships decaying, right? Forget about kinship. Kinship is very stable. I shouldn't tell you this. You can abuse your family, and they will still love you. They will still help you out. But if you do that to your friends, they won't speak to you again very quickly. They're very intolerant. Friendship is very fragile. And this is what these data show again. So here's kinship up here, here's friendship down here. This is plotted as a function of whether over that 18-month period, the amount of time you spent talking to them, perhaps by phone or just having a friendly conversation with them, or doing stuff together, activities together, going shopping together, going to parties together, playing sports together, whether it was increased from the beginning to the end, or was about the same, or decreased. You spent less time, in this case, playing football with them, or whatever it is, or going shopping, in this case, talking to them, or phoning them up. And just look at, for the kinship relationships, they're just very stable. It really doesn't matter. If you spend less time talking to them, you do less things, the relationship, the quality of the relationship is the same. But for friendships, it's a disaster in both cases. Very quickly, the relationship starts to lose its warmness. So that's the big difference. Now, this is the same data split for boys versus girls. And this is very illuminating and may explain a lot in your social world. Okay, so the blue are boys, the green are girls. It's the same thing. Get this right. Okay, this is the other way around because we're looking at what has prevented the relationship declining over time. And it's just for friendships again. So here, you've spent less time contacting them, talking to them. Here you've spent the same amount of time. Here you've spent more time talking to them. And here's the same for activity. Less time spent going shopping with them, about the same. More time spent. Less time spent shopping with them. And here's more time spent shopping with them. All right? Can I get this the right round? Yes, okay. Well, shopping's a bad example here because look at this extraordinary sex difference here, right? For girls, what prevents relationships declining over time is talking together, right? Time spent contacting them, either by phone or going and seeing them, talking to them. For boys, it's doing stuff together. I don't know what boys do. They go out and they bang their heads together. You know? That's what makes relationships for boys. But this extraordinary difference between the two sexes. Now you understand why it's always very confusing when the two sexes get together. All right. Just a little aside on family relationships. Biologists have always assumed that the important thing for family relationships is blood ties, genetic kinship, relationships by blood. But it turns out that actually we treat relatives by marriage very similarly to the way we treat relatives who are true biological relatives. So this is the same data, emotional closeness plotted against time since last contact. And here's the data for friends. Here's the data for kin. See, it's much steeper for kin. Relatively speaking, we differentiate between very close kin and less close kin quite heavily in terms of how much we see them. We don't see our distant relatives very often, but we can still have quite a warm relationship with them. But with friends, it's much shallower, meaning we have to treat all our friends roughly the same. We have to see them much more frequently to make the friendship work. But if you put relatives by marriage in here, affines, which is this dotted line here, it's almost mapped exactly on the genetic kinship. So it turns out that we consider people who are relatives by marriage almost exactly the same way as we consider them our true blood relatives, and quite differently to the way we treat friends. And that's probably because relatives by marriage have a genetic interest in our future in the same way that our true blood relatives do, and that's the biological basis of that. Kinship's very extraordinary, really, because it has a huge impact. Just saying that you're kin to somebody changes your attitude to them completely. And this shows one set of data on your willingness to be altruistic, in some sense, towards different individuals in the different layers of your network. So here's the people from the inner core of 5, people from the 15, people from the 150, and it's split by kin and by friends. And this is, we've used a welfare trade-off ratio here, which is a measure of how much you value their welfare compared to your own. And you can see that as you go out through the layers, so this value decreases, but just look how consistent the difference between kin and friends are. Within each layer, and each layer consists, as it turns out, about half friends and half kin on average, at least in our European samples anyway. Kin are hugely overvalued, if you like, compared to friends. We're much, much more willing to help kin out or to be altruistic towards them than we are to friends. And here's some data from a series of studies. It's very difficult to show these data in a way which looks really convincing, but the statistics are very sound. What it is a series of studies of altruism. We did it 5 times. 3 times in Britain, these 2 studies here, and one of these lines in here, and then the other 2 lines in that are both Zulu populations from South Africa. So we're looking at cultural differences, and we get exactly the same picture in all of them. And what we're doing is we're asking people to take this position, which is sitting with your back against a wall as though on a chair, but with no chair there. It's a skiing exercise to strengthen the quad muscles. And we pay them for how long they can hold that. And they do it several times, once for themselves, once for a relative who's half related to them, mother, father, brother, sister, once to a relative quarter related, once to a relative, whatever that is, eighth related, a cousin, and in some of the studies to a friend and to a children's charity here. And the children's charity always did worse. We're not as altruistic as we think. They always did better for themselves. And there's a general negative relationship between how altruistic they were, how hard they would work for the recipients of this money. What we were asking them to do is to do this exercise, which is very painful, to send money that they earn from doing it to each of these relatives. So, and in general, they were most willing to do it for themselves, least willing to do it for a children's charity, and in between, about in proportion to their degree of genetic relatedness, with the exception of friends. Well, no, I'll say this. These are the girls, these are the boys. You will notice a difference. Right? Girls are not as strong as boys, physically, so it's a very physical thing. This is very funny, actually, because the person who broke the bank on this exercise in this first study, who held this position for hours and hours, and cost us a lot of money, was the resting ballerina. Right? Because physically she was so strong. She was not working as a ballerina at the time, but she was taking time out. But she was very good. But in general, here are the girls doing the same as boys, except to friends. Boys don't think much of their friends. Girls think about it. Girls like their friends a lot. They treat their friends about the same as they treat a sister or brother. That's a friend of the same sex, by the way. So again, another example of how important kinship is to us. Just one more bit of data on that. This is the expectation that where you'll get help from, who will give you help. This is all members of your social circle ranked by that expectation of help from them in your social network. This is just family members only. It's much, much steeper, much tighter. You know your family will help you when you need it. You're less sure about your friends, which is what this shows. So social networks, and particularly networks of relationship, are very important. Here's some very nice data from Nick Kostakis at Harvard, showing that in social networks, and this was all done on one community in America, where they looked at it in great detail over a long period of time, that this is data on the probability of becoming obese, of becoming fat. People who are yellow are medically obese, they're overweight. People who are kind of bluey-green are normal weight. And you'll notice that the yellows tend to cluster together. People who are overweight also have friends and in the network, people who are close to them in the network who are also overweight at the same time. And this even applies to happiness. So the yellow color here is happiness. The blue is being people who said they were unhappy, depressed. And you'll see the blues tend to cluster together. The yellows tend to cluster together. So if you want to be happy, find happy friends. It's much better for you. Okay? And this shows you how strong that effect is. So if I just get this right, this is how happy you are in the future as a function of the happiness of your nearest friend in the network, your closest friend, the friend of a friend, the friend of a friend of a friend. So even 3 steps out in the network to friends of friends of friends, their happiness affects how happy you are. And this is the same kind of data, but just plotted in terms of the number of friends that are happy. So the key lesson here is if you have no friends who are happy, you're quite unlikely to be happy. If you have 1 friend who's happy, you're much more likely to be happy. If you have 2 friends, even more happy. 3 friends is best. But after 3 friends, it doesn't matter. You only need 3 happy friends. And you're fixed for life. Okay? Actually, I'm going to skip this. Really, it's just a bit complicated. We're trying to look at what makes friendship work in terms of how many things do you share with a friend that makes that friendship. So are you from the same village? Do you speak the same language? Do you have the same interests? Do you follow the same sports? All these kind of things. And it just shows that, and these are the 3 layers. Essentially, the more things, there are certain of these traits, if you like, that are more important than others. And it's this sort of setup in here, perhaps the top 6, which seem to be very important. And they typically are having the same educational background. So you're now set for life. You'll have lots of friends. The same hobbies and interests, typically the same religion, the same political views, speak the same language, come from the same place. Those are the kind of things. But this is the effect of that. So this is the average number of things you have in common with friends in the 15 layer as against the 50 layer and the 150 layer. It declines very rapidly as you go out. And that in turn, independently of the layer, affects how willing you are to be generous to that person. So this is a measure of, that same measure of emotional closeness. How warm do you feel about that person? This is, would you donate a kidney to them? Just one measure we used. And you can see that the more traits you share in common, here's 0, here's 5, here's 0, here's 5, the more willing you are, the more emotionally close you feel to them, and the more willing you are to help them out. And it looks like as long as you share at least 2 traits, that's the critical thing. After that, things get better. If you only share 1 trait or no traits, it doesn't really work. But after you share 2 key traits, then things get better and better. And the more traits you share, the closer that relationship is. And that's what makes that relationship work. I'm going to pass over that one. It's too complicated to explain, I think. But the point about networks is also that the members of your network are watching you, right? And here's a very nice little study that was done by the staff common room. People were taking coffee and milk, but not putting money in the tin to pay for the milk and the sugar and so on. So what they did was, in a whole series of weeks, they put out just above the little box on the table, put your money in here for the coffee, just a picture of these flowers. And then in the weeks between, they put pictures of eyes. And they measured the amount of money put in the tin each week. This is wonderful. When they put eyes, the amount of money increased. And when they put flowers, it decreased. Now, the British police were so impressed with these data that in the city of Nottingham, which had a big problem with crime in the city centre, particularly in club times in the evening and so on, they went around putting up little posters of eyes all over the city centre, and they claim it reduced crime on the street by 15%. So this is applied science. So, what makes relationships work in animals, and indeed in us? It's 2 things, and in primates, monkeys and apes, it's this kind of stuff here, grooming, which is how they make their relationships. It's not really cleaning the fur, which is what everybody kind of thinks. What it is more like massage, kind of cuddling and petting in some sense. But what it does is that it triggers the release of endorphins in the brain, which gives you a very slight opiate high. It makes you feel very warm towards the individuals you do this to. And that allows you to create then a cognitive relationship, which is where the social brain bit comes in, which allows you to create a relationship of trust and reciprocation with that individual. I'm just going to show you how that works in humans. In humans, the cognitive bit really is about this stuff, theory of mind, what's known as theory of mind in the developmental literature. It came from philosophy of mind originally, the levels of intentionality. This has been studied in great detail because it's the kind of boundary that 5-year-old children go through when, in some sense, they realize that other people have minds that are different to their own. This is the test for that is the false belief task, so-called. But it turns out that adult humans, that's say us here, can do up to 5th order intentionality. So this is 1st order, 2nd order, which is theory of mind, 3rd order, and we can do 2 more orders beyond that. It's solving these kind of sentences. I understand that you believe, that Fred understands, that we want him to be willing to do something. We can do 5 mind states through that. Turns out that if you ask people to solve those kind of problems, not only to get this nice pitch at 5th order intentionality, this is the best, the average best that people do, A few people can do 6th or 7th order intentionality. Some can only do 3rd or 4th order. Most people are in this range here. But their performance on that correlates with the number of friends they have. So this is how well they can do, how many orders of intentionality they can get up to. This is the size of their inner core 15 layer, essentially, of friends. And you can see there's a lot of mess here, but the better you can do on these problems, the more friends you have. And it turns out from a series of neuroimaging studies we've done that your ability to perform on those kind of tasks and the number of friends you have in that inner 2 circles of up to 15 correlate with the size of the prefrontal cortex. Intentionality performance with the orbital frontal cortex here, the size of the social network with the dorsal part, which is just sort of across the top there. So we don't even have to ask you to tell us how many friends you've got now. We can just measure the size of your brain and we can tell you exactly how many friends you've got. And the other side of the coin, the grooming part, is where time comes in. That's why that issue of how much time you spend talking to your friends or how much time you spend going shopping or going to parties or whatever with your friends becomes important. In primates, it's about grooming. If you look at how much time they spend grooming, as a function of group size, it increases very steadily up to a limit at about 20% of time. So these very social species are spending about 1/5 of their day in this activity. Right? That's a huge amount. Right? If you put humans, well, okay, let me just show you why that works. It's essentially this nice little experiment here by Barry Cavern some years ago, showing that if you give monkeys a tiny, tiny dose of morphine, so small you couldn't measure it in the bloodstream, they lose interest in grooming in this way. The number of times they ask to be groomed, the amount of time they spend grooming, drops considerably compared to a saline control. And if you give them an opiate blocker, and this is why this experiment is very nice, an opiate blocker like naltrexone, which locks onto the same receptor sites in the brain but doesn't have this opiate effect, then they suddenly want to try, constantly trying to get other animals to groom them. They can't get enough. And it's this effect here which explains why drug addicts, opium addicts, morphine addicts, lose interest in the social world. They're getting their kind of social high, as it were, artificially, and so they don't need to go and make friendships anymore. But if you plot humans in here, then you'd expect us, with our group size, if we were doing this exactly the same way as the monkeys and apes, we'd have to spend about 45% of our total daytime, that's nearly half of your day, doing this activity, grooming, to support these big groups. This is very bad because you wouldn't have time to go to the library or lectures. It would be very pleasant, maybe. And in fact, we don't. These are data from a series of studies of time budgets in humans, and it shows that on average, we spend only about 20% of our time in social interaction as well. So a lot of variation here. Remember, these points are averages for species too, so there's variation. Key thing is the position of the average there, that blue line. We spend almost the same amount as the most social primates in social interaction. For us, it's this kind of stuff here, mostly talking. But there's something missing from talking, and that's where you get the endorphin hit from. Why, how do you get that if you don't actually touch somebody? Okay, for intimate relationships, maybe you get it, but just having a conversation with somebody, there's no kind of mechanism to produce that endorphin hit. And we think that kind of what's happened is we've introduced these mechanisms to do that. So this is a plot of how much grooming time you'd have to do for group size predicted from brain size for all our fossil lineage, from the Australopithecines down here up to modern humans up here. So this is the 20% for apes. Here's the 45% for modern humans. This big gap up here is essentially the bonding gap. We're not spending enough time grooming. And what do we think has happened is we have introduced laughter and then music and dancing and finally the rituals of religion to produce these endorphin hits, because all three of these do this very well. And here's some evidence of this for at least the first two. This is a small series of studies we've done on music, looking at pain thresholds as a measure of endorphins, because endorphins are about the pain control system, for singing versus just plain prayer, religious groups, a drumming group compared to just listening and to music and watching a boring video. And what they're doing is they do a pain test done like this, using an old-fashioned blood monitor, which is very painful. They then watch a video and then they're tested again, and it's the change in the pain threshold from here to here that's critical. So if there's no change, it should be here at 0. For the control people who are doing non-musical things, there's no different. For the ones that are doing these musical activities, it goes up. And this is the same for laughter. Again, this is 5 studies here. Here's 0, no change. These are the people watching the boring videos. These are the people watching comedy videos, or at a comedy event at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, the famous artistic festival in Scotland. And you have this big difference. Watching comedy or laughing, that's to say, or playing music or singing produces this surge of endorphins, and it gives you this warm feeling with those you do it with. And it makes you treat strangers as friends. This is a pilot study we've done looking at people who either watch a comedy video here in blue or in the lighter color, a neutral video, a boring video, and of each pair, all the money for the experiment is given to one, and they're told, split this how you like with the other person. If you come with a friend, it doesn't really matter whether you watch the boring video or the fun video, you give them about half. We gave them 5 pounds, English pounds. They gave about £2.50 on average to the other person, so they split it equally. If you came with a stranger, you only gave them about less than £1 out of the £5. But if you watched a boring video, but if you watched a comedy video and you laughed with them, you treated them like a friend. This is a stranger you've never met before. You gave them about half. So laughing together turns strangers into friends, basically. And that's how we bond these big communities that we have. I'm going to skip that. Okay, I'll just add this because it's kind of interesting in terms of that religion bit. These are some data from Rich Sosis at the University of Connecticut on the survival times for religious and secular communities, utopian communities, communes, if you like, that were founded in the USA during the 19th century. And what he's done here is he's plotted how long the community lasted from the time it was founded. These include small communities that nobody's ever heard of, includes people like the Shakers, the Mormons, many of these better-known ones. And this is the proportion that fall into that category. These are secular communities. They have no religious commitment whatsoever. These are religious communities. And you can see that religious communities that have some religious foundation to them last better and last longer, and they start with bigger group sizes than those that don't. It's very weird. We don't understand why that's true, but there's something about that kind of spiritual world, if you like, that encourages people to behave better in a community and make them not break the rules, if you like. And one of those possibilities is, of course, the perception of God watching you. God is the policeman in the sky watching what you do. So we don't understand why this effect works entirely, but it's clear that it has a huge effect on bonding these kind of communities. So I just really finish up with this observation, because the world is becoming much more global, clearly. It's also becoming hugely urbanized. By 2050, 80% or 85% of the entire world population will be living in cities and not in the countryside anymore. And that's creating huge pressures all around. It's making these capacity to have these small bonded communities which behave well towards each other and are committed to each other very difficult to do. The whole thing is in some sense, is breaking down. So the challenge for us, well, not for me, I'm already over the hill and a long way down the other side. But for you, the big challenge in the future is going to be how to turn our psychology that we have from evolution, which is very small scale and allows only really for small scale relationships and small scale communities, how to adapt that to allow us to live in very, very large mega communities more successfully than we're doing now. And on that thought, thank you very much. Well, in principle, evolution never stops, right? It goes on all the time. So in principle, we could evolve a bigger brain or a more efficient brain to handle larger communities. It's just a matter of selection and enough generations. I guess our problem is, are we being overwhelmed by the problems of political disruption and urban unhappiness faster than we can actually evolve bigger brains? Because this is sort of hardware problem, you know, and that only comes from genetics. That said, the problem is to increase the number of people you can have, let's say even to go from 150 to 1,500 in your community size, your personal network size, would require you to, I don't know, multiply the size of your brain 10 times. And this is not seriously practical. Well, there is a problem about giving birth to babies with such big brains. Okay. It's already bad, right? Remember, in humans give birth to babies that are 1 year premature compared to the babies of other monkeys and apes, because we have a problem of getting a very large head through a very small hole, the birth canal. And so to try and cope with that, what's happened in the course of humanity, and that's partly because of our standing upright. 6 million years ago, our ancestors decided to stand upright. This was fine, it was very efficient. We had small brains, size of a chimpanzee's brain, gorilla's brain, it didn't matter. But 4 million years later, some stupid idiot decided to have a bigger brain. And by that stage, the birth canal, if we had ape monkey birth canals, it would not be so much of a problem. But by standing upright, we created these bowl-shaped pelvis to give greater stability when you're walking on 2 legs. And that caused the birth canal to sort of be pushed down and made smaller. So the solution to that in the course of late human evolution, the last 500,000 years only, is to produce babies which are so premature they're already on the edge of survival. Right? Now, if you're going to have even bigger brained adults, you must either make these babies completely impossible to survive, so it wouldn't happen, or you have to have increased the size of women's hips. Right? And that means, you know, men's hips will get dragged along in the wake of that, so it will never be possible to run faster than Usain Bolt now. right? Because it just won't happen. Men will no longer be capable of running anymore. Very good for rugby, so I can recommend Peru gets into rugby. So there are technical problems about that. That's the negative side. On the positive side, it's not all about hardware, because a lot of this social brain stuff is really about the software programming too. And so we know that, for example, how quickly children go through these theory of mind type thresholds is affected by the number of children in the family, the number of brothers and sisters they have. So socialization would be one solution. It gives you more practice. So it's like a computer in effect. Right? You've got the hardware, the brain, the neurons, but you have to put the software in there, and the stuff has to practice, right, to get the final result. So one solution might be to have more social practice, more socialization for young children, for example. But I don't know whether that would solve all those problems either, because the scale of the problem is so big now. We do have a problem going the other way, in that because the areas of the brain that are important to this, the frontal lobes up here, the prefrontal cortex in particular, those are the last areas to mature and develop. They don't really develop until you're about 25. This is why we think teenagers have so much trouble with relationships compared to adults, who find them very easy. It just takes a lot of practice and a lot of brain maturity before these processes become very efficient. Now, it looks like because of urbanization, one of the bad sides of urbanization is you have a lot of economic inequality, and the people who are very poor end up with having much slowed down brain growth in those key areas. So they end up doing less well at school, they have more trouble, they get in trouble with the police and so on, because they don't have these areas which are good at handling sort of the social world and being sensitive to the other members of the community that you live with. So you can see kind of, we could be going that way very easily if we're not careful, I guess. Long answer to a short question. Sorry? Oh, is this? Yeah. Sure. Oops. Hola.
Thanks. Professor Dunbar, actually I don't think that you're right about the volume of the head. You said at the beginning of your lecture that it was the neocortex which evolved, and also the prefrontal area that evolved. Actually, the frontal lobe become 1/3 of the whole brain. So it's not the amount of cerebral mass.
Sure.
It's the number of connections, of neocortical connections, which provided the evolution, and not only the neocortex we called eulaminar,
yep,
but also the neocortex we call transitional, where the speech connections are codify this our psychic activity.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. I agree entirely with everything you said. The problem it certainly isn't total brain size. You can see that quite clearly, even if you look at within primates, because primates vary in how much of the brain is devoted to different parts of the brain. So the gorilla has a very big brain, the biggest brain certainly of the non-human primates, but it has a very small neocortex because it has a very, very large cerebellum because of handling a very big body, huge body mass when it's climbing in trees, most likely. So it isn't the whole brain. This is why we partition out in the original analyses, the subcortical regions, and just look at neocortex, essentially neocortex size. And since then, we've tried even to remove parts of the neocortex, for example, the visual areas in the occipital lobe at the back, because these are not related to these social processes. Our problem has been we don't have good enough brain data from the anatomists over many species to look at. And this is why we tried the neuroimaging experiments to look at within humans the size of bits of the brain, if you like, in a much finer detail in relation to their social skills and their network size. And you can see both the importance of the frontal lobes, which are kind of well known to be important in the social skills and so on. But also you can see the networking side of it as well. That's clearly important, which is what you really mentioned in particular there. Because if you, in the voxel-based morphometry study that was also up there, the second graph, the areas that really come up are the key theory of mind areas, which are up here in the frontal lobe, but also here on the temporal lobe, the temporal pole, and the temporal parietal junction. Right, so that they're forming part of a network across the cortex, or at least parts of the cortex, which are crucial. Our problem is we simply do not have good enough quality anatomical data and histological data on the brain for enough species. You know, we have one or two species that are well studied, but we don't have it on enough species to be able to look across the big kind of evolutionary picture and see how the relationships are. So we've been praying for people to do more histological data of this kind, but it's very, people don't like to do it anymore. But
I'm afraid we will never have enough histological. No,
yeah.
Excuse me, but it's not the amount of cells it's the amount of connections.
Oh yeah, I mean, no, I agree entirely.
So
yeah.
there is.
I mean, our problem is we don't have enough data on that either, and we don't have it for enough species. Ultimately, that's, I'm sure, is actually what it's all about. Our best proxy for that, all I'm saying is our best proxy at the moment is volume. That's all.
Mr. Dunbar, thank you very much for your lecture. I had a question about Skype, the happiness rate, and I wanted to know if Skype had this successful happiness rate because it could whether replace or emulate the kinship relationship. And apart from a technical fact, Skype is equipped both with a webcam and a microphone and a chat surface, and that enhances the other person to feel the other person closer. And I want to know if that will have any direct relationship with kinship, because we are likely more to expect facial, oral, and visual contact with relatives. And if Skype, because of this technical improvement from other social networks such as Facebook or even Microsoft Messenger, could improve and enhance this contact as if it was real.
To be honest, we have no idea why things like Skype work as well as they do, but what we think it is you have a sense of being in the same room together at the same time. It's much more, when you tell somebody a joke, it's instantaneous, they respond, right? Whereas if you send an email to somebody and you tell them a joke, by the time it gets there, it's not very funny. And by the time the reply comes back, you can't remember what the joke was, right? So you have a kind of simultaneity problem there. But that aside, the other thing that's clearly very important in human social interactions is facial expressions or body movements, just these very, very small, subtle expressions we give all the time, which kind of allow you to interpret what the person is saying. So you know whether when they say something, they really mean it, or they're just being silly, or it's a joke, or they're being rude even. You know, the same words in any language can be used in these to mean many different kinds of things. And we show that by the facial expressions or the way we hold our body, or whether we laugh or not in the context of speaking. So those kind of subtleties seem to be what Skype is picking up. As I understand what you were asking, the issue about visual similarity and kinship, I think that's a slightly separate question, because that's about what cues we use to recognize people as being kin. And undoubtedly we use visual cues a lot, and we comment when we meet somebody we've never met before, but who is a relative because let's say they their grandparents emigrated to another continent, and now they come back and introduce themselves to you and say, oh, you just look like, my cousin or my brother or whatever it is. You look very similar. You have that family look. Yeah. But actually it turns out in our skiing exercise experiment, the best predictor of kinship that people used was how long they'd spent with that person in the first 10 years of life. Right? So if they'd grown up in the same household, or they'd seen a lot of them, remember, this was particularly the Zulu communities, but it was also true in London, in fact. The small communities, you living with relatives in the village all over the place, so you're seeing these people all the time, or the family gets together many times a year, not just at Christmas perhaps. It's how much time you actually spent with that in that very, very young period. It looks like a period of imprinting, and that's one of the key cues, in addition maybe to visual cues, that we seem to use as indicators of kinship. If you grew up with them, they must be kin.
Thank you. I was just wondering, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something about the experiments being played with friends from the same sex? Same-sex
yeah,
friends?
that was our attempt to try and have a control for non-genetically related people. So everybody else was genetically related to you. So we just wanted somebody who wasn't genetically related to you, but who was close to you. And so we took a friend of the same sex, not the opposite sex, because we didn't want romantic love to get in the way. Because the boys would be so generous to the girls if that was the case. So, does that answer the question? Or?
Yeah, because I was wondering, maybe with different sex friends, results could have been different.
Sure, yes, absolutely. And that's why we particularly wanted to make it same-sex friends. And we made it clear that there were not to be a romantic relationship. That was the whole point to the people, because they had to choose somebody in that category. Or at least give us a list of people who fell into that category, that we could choose one person who would be the target for that task. So, we asked them to make a list of all their brothers and sisters, of all their aunties and uncles and so on, and all their friends in that category. And then we would choose one and say, now you are doing this exercise for this person, and we will send the money to that person. We wanted to be sure that they weren't friends in a romantic sense in particular, because in a previous experiment many years before, we were looking at cooperation in tasks, how willing people would be to cooperate if they thought and help somebody else get some money, if they thought that in a subsequent occasion those friends would help them. And we just discovered the results were a mess until we realized that whenever there were girls present, suddenly the boys became incredibly generous.
Hello. I was thinking about the case of those people whose works force them to be in touch with lots of people, like people who work in healthcare or therapists or some kind of charity. Do they still have that, or would they have that same limit, like 150 persons, or would their work make them widen this amount?
Well, there are two interesting possibilities here. One is that they will still have the people they would count as real friends, whether they're family or true friends. Let's call them Facebook friends, because Facebook doesn't distinguish relatedness in this sense. They would still have that limit, but the people that they contact in their working environment would sit in these outer layers, in the 500 and 1500 layers. They're people they know, but they wouldn't probably count them as friends. They wouldn't invite them to the barbecue at home on Saturday. That's the test. Would you be happy for them to come and eat your dinner? That's the key test. So that's one answer. The other answer is, it's quite possible that, we know there's lots of individual variation. I showed you some data on that. Some people have very large inner circles, some people have very small inner circles, and that seems to be related to their mentalizing skills, their intentionality skills, social skills, social cognitive skills. Now, it may well be that people who are very skilled on those kind of things and have more than 15 friends and perhaps have 20 friends in their 15 layer are the kind of people that go into those kind of jobs because they find them attractive. And because they can handle more people, they become more successful. So, and I think this is a possible explanation for what happens with people who, politicians or the president of the university or the chief, executive of a big company. They can go around. There are two possibilities here again. They seem to know everybody, right? The successful ones, and it's either because they have enormous brains, and this is true, I'm sure, of the president of the university. You may doubt if this is true of politicians. The alternative possibility is they have kind of skills, people skills, which allow them to pretend that people in the 1500 layer, people they see once a year maybe only, that they know them really well. So that, when the president of the university comes up to you and says, "Oh, how are you? I haven't seen you for a very long time," and asks them questions, it's like being at a spiritualist performance by a medium. How mediums feed questions to the audience. I'm hearing a voice, have you lost somebody recently? And everybody goes, yes, it's me, because they're reading into what the medium is saying from their life. So when the president of the university comes along and says, how are you, and how's your mother, and how's your great auntie, and all those kind of things, you immediately think, oh, he remembers who I am. I'm part of his 150, but no, he's just very good at handling those kinds of things to make you feel as though you're part of his. Yeah. Two more? Okay.
It's about gossip. For example, I have a friend who always talk me about another person, and sometimes I feel closer to that person, but I don't know her, or I don't know. But could gossip make the relationship closer?
The answer is yes, because gossip, and I'm taking gossip in this sense to mean just, what they're doing now, and these kind of things, not negative gossip, critical gossip. This is what makes it possible to have these big social networks, because the problem, if you think of it from monkeys' point of view, with their small groups, their knowledge of the state of the network is dependent on what they see. If they don't see it, they don't know about it. what language allows us to do is to find out about what everybody else is doing without actually having to go and see it. So that becomes very important in allowing us to extend the size of our social networks. And the interesting thing in the context of relationships between friendship and kinship in this context, that's very relevant here in many ways, is that kinship networks tend to be much denser. They're more interconnected than friendship networks. Friendship networks a little bit tend to be more like a hub with spokes going out. You at the center and then sort of lines, and fewer lines between the friends. Whereas kinship networks, the kin are all interconnected. And on top of that, you often find you have what's usually known now as a kin keeper, and usually a woman who is very keen to find out about everybody's new babies and you know how they've done at university and tell everybody else. And that person then keeps that information going around the system, so everybody's able to keep up with it. And you don't get that with friendships. Usually, by comparison, of course, you have kind of people who do that in friendship circles who tell you the gossip, but it doesn't seem to be such a big effect. And this is the real constraint, or one possible constraint on the number of relationships that you can have, is just how much information we can get hold of through these means, just by interacting. And that was what Facebook was trying to solve for us, if you like. That was kind of at the back, intuitively at the back of their minds, because they remember it started at Harvard, by undergraduates at Harvard, looking into the future and realizing they were going to be all their friends were going to leave. How they keep up with them? They would lose friends, best friends in their lives, and they would no longer see them. So this was a way of keeping up that information. And the answer is it kind of works, but it's not really in the end a really satisfactory replacement. In other words, the real problem is not just finding out about what's going on in the circle, but actually kind of sitting down and having person-to-person interactions with these people. So gossip's good, but it's not the answer to the world's crises.
Professor Dunbar, some people claim that as much as we have a social mind, we also have a moral mind.
Yep.
That would be something like a moral organ in the brain that compels us to be cooperative, altruistic, or compassionate under certain conditions. That is what Hauser believes us, for instance. I wonder, what do you think about that? And thank you very much for your wonderful talk.
Okay, the answer goes back to my little aside about the Hutterites and the Amish quite early in the talk, that as I see it, the problem, well, there's one step back. Species like primates, which have developed these very intensely social ways of life as their solution to the problems of survival, if you like. And there are a relatively small number of species that do that. The primates are the main one, who are very large. The other 2 or 3 big groups that seem to have adopted the same kind of solution are the horse family, so the horses, the donkeys, the zebra, and so on. The camelids, that's to say the llamas and the alpacas and the camels, which is amazing. We hadn't known they were quite so intensely social. The dolphins in particular, and the elephants. They have very intense social lives. And what it is, in effect, is to create these very bonded social groups which allow them to solve the problems of survival communally rather than individually. So by clubbing together, they get a bigger return from defending themselves against predators or whatever it may be. Now, the problem with, as you'll know, with all those kind of, in effect, it's an implicit social contract in the philosophical sense. The problem with all those kind of social contract type situations is free riders. The temptation to take the benefits of the contract but not pay the costs is enormous because you get a double benefit then. So the problem for all these species is how to prevent free riders from wiping out the social contract. So they need to have mechanisms to do that. And we think that one of those mechanisms is producing these very bonded relationships, which then allow them to feel committed to each other, so they will go to each other's support. They won't renege on the contract and so on. Now, our problem is, with our big communities, we have this problem enormously by comparison to the primates. So we needed some mechanisms that kind of bridge that bigger scale to allow it. And I think there are many components that you can see. One of them are all these kind of laughter and dancing and religion type components which allow us just to bond. It's kind of like grooming at a distance. We can now groom with several people at once, whereas grooming in primates is a one-on-one activity. You only groom with one individual. So you have that increase in scale. We have all these mechanisms for detecting free riders, all the kind of Cosmides 2B type stuff. And on top of that, I think quite clearly what's happened is and this is, if you like, the morality side of religion as opposed to ritual side of religion, you've had this sort of evolution of the free riders, the selfishness component of the free riders, because it's quite clear in all these systems, if you let free riders loose, they just wipe the contract out because everybody starts to worry about themselves and not be committed to the community. So I'm sure that's kind of part of the evolutionary story, and I kind of completely agree with Mark Hauser and anybody else in that line.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunbar, for sharing your interesting ideas with all of us. Muchas gracias a todos. Mañana a las 10 de la mañana en punto es el primer taller sobre la evolución del lenguaje. Será hasta la 1 de la tarde y el siguiente, como todos ustedes saben, de 3 a 6. Muchas gracias por su asistencia y su participación. En nombre de Mente y Lenguaje, Estudios Generales y la Escuela de Posgrado.